Yay.
Okay. Yeah, ready to rock and roll. I'll go ahead and kick us off here. Welcome to another event of the Body Keeps the Score weekly book review, our kind of community review of this wonderful book about trauma and the impacts on the body. And, just thank you so much for your time. I know I can speak for myself. I'm kind of caught in that corporate grind that we talk about from time to time with a very busy week and, dialing out with limited energy, running from this to that. So it's a real gift to have some time to spend together on this. And I'm getting so much from going through the book together. So I look forward to a little bit of pause after today's event. We're going to pause for 4 weeks and then come back around the middle of May and resume with chapters 11 through 20.
Mm-hmm.
And some norms to help guide us through sensitive topics. We're not necessarily any type of professional therapy group here. We're just peer-to-peer exploration on the book and the research it represents. So if by any means you want to explore some of the themes that we check out in these books, we highly, highly recommend that you do so with the guidance of a professional. Please no fixing and advising. But if you are open to feedback, please state that, if you have a question or want to ask what others have experienced. I and you statement hygiene, I'm a big fan of this. Sometimes when you hear the words like I heard you say, it can sound judgmental and almost argumentative. So I like to soften that language with like, I think what I understood or, I think what I heard, it just helps kind of soften the back and forth dialogue if it comes up. We do endeavor to keep all the shares confidential. We do have a YouTube channel that this streams to kind of help widen the access to our event. We do have several people that come in on the stream, so hello to you if you're watching live or after the event. We always love the chat messages that come in too on Discord and the YouTube live chat. But from a confidentiality standpoint, we're not here to collect gossip or any data or sell personal information, nothing like that. So we do hope we create a safe place to share. And we have a hand raise feature too. So if you do have something that you'd like to share, feel free to put your name on the board, and that really helps me know that you have something you'd like to add to the topic. And there's also the weekly open discussion on Discord. We have the Discord channel for any kind of things that come up and might be interesting for a chat, forum style discussion. So if anything comes up during the week, feel free to make a post. And with that, let's dive into Chapter 10's topics here. And it kind of opens up with a really big question in the psychiatry and counseling world these days, which is if developmental trauma is so common, which we're finding out through all of these research studies, that developmental trauma, does have a significant portion in the population of people that go to like obesity clinics, domestic violence shelters. So how did it become such a hidden epidemic? And we have yet another anecdote from Dr. van der Kolk's personal experience where, and this really is always tough for me to read. A 2.5-year-old in this case is referred to the clinic because of behavior that's very aggressive and violent, like biting and kicking and screaming. And Dr. van der Kolk arranged to meet with the child with their mother to kind of observe their relationship. And what he observed is when the child reached out for their mother, they were kind of pushed away and verbally, reprimanded. Don't, be such a baby and keep reaching for me. It happened a couple of times, and then the 2.5-year-old like kind of went into a corner and, as a self kind of soothing coping behavior, started banging their head into the wall. And the mother's comment was, "He just does that to bug me." So you can imagine the complete like disconnection between mother and child there. But also we talked about how important it is for a child to biologically imprint on a primary caregiver, and if that caregiver is unsafe, that's almost the core of developmental trauma experience. But before we shame and blame that mother, what's her story? How was her mother as a caretaker? How was that mother's father? How were they raised? What about that father's mother? Like this. I think as we're gonna find out as we get through the material, it's very generational. This kind of trauma can be passed down. And of course, we talked in Chapter 9 quite a bit. And welcome, Tom. I'm glad you could make it. And in Chapter 9, we talked about like barriers to care. That even though we've made so much progress making trauma kind of like a household term, most everybody has a fundamental understanding of what trauma means. We kind of still have this incomplete care where if you seek care, there's this manual called the DSM, and it defines all these different disorders like depression and ADHD and anxiety. Well, that book actually constrains what you can be diagnosed with. And what Dr. van der Kolk talked about to a great degree in Chapter 9 was that these individual disorder diagnoses don't like paint the full story of developmental trauma. So one of his kind of life goals is to get these diagnoses that are wider and broader for having childhood specific caretaker related, chronic trauma type experiences. So when Dr. Vanderkolk was asked for a diagnosis for this 2.5-year-old, his diagnosis wasn't, that the kid had anxiety disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. He said he was scared to death and fighting for his life, and he did not trust his primary caregiver. Very life circumstance and situational, and having like nothing to do with like a mental or personality disorder. And another heartbreaker here, a 15-year-old Latina by the name of Marina was sent to the clinic after repeated suicide attempts at 15 years old. It's hard to know these things. It's not that you don't know they're happening. It's just when you're kind of faced with it, this is the world we live in, where people fall out of the edges of, care in their family and in society. And, this is the path that they ultimately have to walk. And, Marina was obese, aggressive, even mute, almost refusing to communicate, impulsive and violent, describing herself as garbage, worthless, rejected. Which is the way that developmental trauma gets internalized. How many times in the past have maybe you heard a friend say that they hate themselves, and like how much that just hurts to hear. This really hit home because, it really reminds me of my dad's experience. Lived in more than 20 foster care placements by the age of 9. Holy cow. And you try to imagine that some of those shuffles were probably after infancy, so that could be like 3-4 moves in 1 year. So what Dr. Vanderkolk did in this case, which we're kind of getting to know, know about him at this point, is instead of diagnosing, he tried to find out like what is going on with this person's nervous system, and he was able to get her into an equine therapy program, and she responded incredibly well to it. And when Dr. Vanderkolk was talking to her at her graduation, she went to school and graduated. This is how much it impacted her life. She told Dr. Vanderkolk that the animal therapy was what really helped turn the corner, because when she approached this horse, she got the feeling that the horse was actually looking forward to their time together. And she learned how to care for that horse, which in turn, sometimes when you learn to care about others, you accidentally learn to care about yourself. And this is the magic that I love to see with animal-based programs, especially, like rescue animals that they pair with prisoners. I love programs like that where it's just such a win-win. And Marina ultimately got accepted into college as well. So this is hopefully one of those stories where she got the right care at the right time and was able to carve out a different path. So this is another common kind of, not sure the right term for it, but, a question that comes up when Dr. Vanderkolk presents his ideas and research is that, we get our personalities and our disorders through our genes. If our parents had it, if our grandparents had it, then they pass it down through heredity. And Dr. Vanderkolk's response to that is that, if it's genetics that cause, mental illness, and the research is able to prove that, then how come, after 30 years and hundreds of millions of dollars of studying schizophrenia and heredity, like we still don't know the link, like after all of that effort and money, and ultimately they also find out it was multiple genes that contribute to the development of schizophrenia. So they can't even really yet identify what the combination of different genes and different amounts might lead to a schizophrenia. So it's not really a slam dunk to just say, your father had depression, so therefore, I find other illnesses like hypertension, like high blood pressure. A lot of times they blame that on heredity. Well, what could cause high blood pressure? How about a dysregulated nervous system from developmental trauma? So some of these things can get passed down, in my opinion, but maybe not passed down through genetics, but passed down through life experience and the ways our families teach us to regulate and handle stress and conflict. There's also this kind of fascinating process, and I'm not a chemist or a microbiologist, so I'm by no means an expert to speak on this, but I'm kind of fascinated to learn more, is that there's this process called methylation, which is these hydrogen and carbon and oxygen molecules kind of bond, and our body actually attaches them to specific parts in our genes, right to our DNA. And the attachment of these extra components onto our genes kind of act like a volume on a radio, where you kind of turn the volume up or you turn the volume down. So, whatever that gene is particularly responsible for, this methylation process can sort of turn it up or turn it down. And these extra methylation processes on our genes are also linked to schizophrenia, depression, and bipolar disorder, and PTSD. And this methylation process is caused by life events. Like, this is not something that's baked into your genes, into your DNA. This is something that happens through life experience, that your body sort of reprograms itself, and it can do so in a way to affect your stress response. Are you more susceptible to a high level of stress? So very, very interesting down to the, I wasn't expecting we were going to dive into some biology and DNA and genes in this book, but how fascinating we get to learn about this stuff. So there's even something called epigenetic inheritance, where when we're embryos, what happens is usually this methylation is kind of wiped from the genes that are passed to us when we're in our early embryo development phases. But they found out that some of this methylation can actually survive through the reset. So we actually can, have some of this methylation passed down to us, through what our parents experienced. So we're really getting this kind of generational trauma all the way down to the biological level, even. Which makes me really excited about the research on CRISPR technology, which is, scientists are now learning how to kind of splice and modify genes, kind of turn genes on and off. And, this technology is really in its infancy. It went from like conceptual to now they can do it, but, now they have to kind of get through the types of studies to prove that it's safe. And I think it was sickle cell anemia was one of the first illnesses that they're really having success in treating by kind of turning back on the genes that help you kind of steer away from that illness. And also welcome, Kaylin. I'm really happy to see you and that you could join us. Glad to see you there. So we really kind of come back to this idea of how much life experience can affect our nervous system development, and how much in the past that was sort of just mutually agreed that you just had these genes that came from your family. Well, we're finding out more and more that there's a lot of the nature versus nurture. The nature component has a really big say. And this researcher by the name of Michael Meany, I feel like that's such a qualifying name for a researcher in this case. It reminds me, I actually had a dentist whose name was literally Dr. Fear. And I just thought that was the most amazing name. And he gave me an implant that's lasted still up to, I think, 22 years ago. I still have the dental implant he put in, so he's an amazing dentist. But what Dr. Meany found was that how much the mother rat grooms their pups within the first 12 hours of their birth permanently affects their brain chemicals that respond to stress. It modifies over 1,000 genes. So, just incredible. Just in the first 12 hours, this developmental milestone occurs for rats. So I found that fascinating and wanted to for sure put a slide in here on that. And Dr. Somi, he actually got a lot of backlash for these studies, and ultimately PETA sued, and they actually cannot do studies like this anymore, thankfully. So interesting data and findings that helps understand trauma, but the price is just too much for these studies, so it's impossible to condone. But the studies were made mainly around maternal deprivation, taking young monkeys away from their parents and kind of studying what that kind of impact that has on their lifespan. And what was ultimately found is that monkeys with high stress genes, that had aggressive mothers, this idea of course, their offspring is also going to be aggressive, was challenged, by replacing those monkeys with supportive mothers. So taking that young monkey away from the aggressive mother and putting it in the care of a supportive mother, and finding that monkey began to thrive. These aggressive behaviors curbed as they began to feel safe. And some monkeys were also taken away from their mother and put in groups of peers. So development without a parent, just through a peer group. And they found out that those monkeys began to metabolize serotonin differently compared to monkeys that were raised by any mother, either aggressive or supportive. So, affecting the monkey's development to the point of how well they could process serotonin, by not having a bona fide primary caregiver. And Kaylin, I'm getting just a little feedback from your mic, so if you could mute, of course, unless you raise your hand, because we want to hear from you if you got something to add. But thank you.
Was it the oxygen you were hearing? The hissing? Is that what you were hearing?
It may have been. It was like an intermittent kind of echoey sound. Yeah.
Okay. I'll mute.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so sorry to ask. But yeah, thank you. So, the DSM defines trauma as a person who is exposed to a horrendous event that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury to self or others, causing intense fear, helplessness, horror, which leads to re-experiencing of the event, leading to behavioral disorders. So a big mouthful of things there. But I think the important thing to take away is that bookend side of the definition, right? There's like a beginning and an end of something that happened that was life-threatening to either self or others, and creates these kind of echoes of memory that keep coming back and exciting our nervous system, and eventually programming that nervous system in ways that make it difficult to function normally. But the challenge here is that it's an acute event, right? Like something that happened. You were at a bank that got robbed. You got in a car accident. You were mugged, on the way to the grocery store. So what they're trying to propose, Dr. van der Kolk and a large group of psychologists are trying to propose this idea of developmental trauma, where you have things like unresolved attachment, a primary caregiver that you didn't feel safe with, or maybe no primary caregiver at all. That's not an acute event. That's like a lifetime of experience. A pervasive pattern of dysregulation. So just again, like going back to this feeling of safety. Remember on the ACE tests, we had quite a few people answered that they never had anyone to feel safe with, and how much that led to nervous system dysregulation throughout their whole life. Problems with attention and concentration that can really affect development, and difficulty getting along with others. Of course, that's how we get isolated. So the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, in their infinite wisdom, the snail's pace at which we progress, said that they were very unlikely to include developmental trauma in DSM-5. And their response was no new diagnosis was needed to fill a missing diagnosis niche. So they classified this trauma diagnosis that Dr. van der Kolk is trying to show through these studies of developmental childhood trauma as a niche diagnosis. Like, there's so few cases of it, it's not really, needed in something as structured as the DSM. And to further that, the notion that adverse childhood experience lead to substantial development disruption is more clinical intuition than a research-based fact. There's not enough research to support it, was their response. There was a really major kind of shift, I think, when the DSM-5 came out, and it was missing the developmental trauma component. And, the psychology world responded, and there was the formation of this institute, if I could read it there, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is universities, hospitals, tribal agencies, drug rehab programs. All of these organizations sort of unified, and they support schools, hospitals, welfare agencies, homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters. So, this is support kind of outside of the medical care community, now through these kind of unified programs. And, that got funding and approval through Congress even. So, national support. There's the Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control that did the ACE study, the adverse childhood experience, that kind of 10-question test we talked about, which I think might be one of the single most, kind of popularizing childhood trauma. It got a very nice TED Talk where the doctor linked adverse childhood experience scores to major illnesses. And I think really furthered the knowledge and the acceptance of this kind of diagnosis. And research clinicians spoke out. You know, the American Psychological Association and the American Counseling Association, like two of the biggest, organizations for membership and, furthering the field. They made a statement, why are relationships and social conditions left out? If you only pay attention to biology and genes, you'll run into as many problems as previous generations who just blamed everything on parenting. So wow, like a very line in the sand kind of statement back to the DSM from the APA. And the National Institute of Mental Health, the director at the time, Thomas Insel, he also made a public statement. Our agency can no longer support symptom-based diagnosis. So remember, Dr. Vanderkolk talked about that diagnosis chasm, where they only focus on like what your coping mechanisms are and not really the story of where they came from. Our focus will be our function will be to focus on research domain criteria, otherwise known as RDOC, allowing research to finally cross multiple diagnoses. So, he's there, publicly stating and recognizing that it's kind of inefficient to just give somebody a singular diagnosis and treatment when there's a multitude of potential reasons. So that's a picture there of Director Thomas Insel. And after these announcements went out, Dr. Vanderkolk mentioned there was a huge influx in research dollars finally. So research was finally redirected from the individual diagnosis of, like ADHD or depression. And, not to say that those wouldn't continue to be studied, but they would be studied in a broader foundation of interconnected coping mechanisms and situations rather than the individual symptom itself. And I thought it would be interesting. I asked ChatGPT when it predicts that developmental trauma disorder would be added into the DSM, which will probably be 6 at this point, and it predicted 2032, which was probably around about the time that it's about every 10 to 15 years they come out with a new one. And the last one I think was 2022. So that might just be some basic ChatGPT math. But that sounds about right. So this topic will come again, probably about, the beginning of the next decade. And this wasn't necessarily in the book, but kind of a personal question that I often think about as a thought experiment, but like, is lacking identification and treatments for developmental trauma disorders like literally humanity's biggest challenge? Because what keeps coming to my mind is like, we can as a species like do amazing things in very short time frames when we put our mind to it. So like all of these existential crises that we keep facing, world kind of ending, life ending kind of crises, we could fix these things. Like we have the knowledge and the tools and, the creativity, the resources, but what often happens is you make progress towards these things these big existential threats to like our very existence, and somebody gets in the way and kind of stops it or redirects it or corrupts it, and we got quite a Mount Rushmore of people you would not want to know on the top there. And some of these people are psychotic. They're pretty extreme examples, but when you're growing up and you don't have a feeling of safety, and you kind of develop this dysregulated nervous system, we talked about how that can affect you, where you might shut down on a regular basis, go numb, or your fight instincts might get elevated. You become like belligerent and aggressive, very reactive. And we even saw cases of dissociation, right? Where you sort of, kind of split outside of your body, and you kind of become this like functioning person in society. But, this like memory and painful traumatic experiences just sort of buried in this numb fog, almost like a duality of personality. And, how many of those people grow into adults that, kind of turn their coping mechanisms like against the world? Some people might choose an empathetic path where they feel like, oh, that kind of stunk for me. I hope I can help prevent that from happening to others. But, of course, there's multiple facets to humanity. And, do some people decide, what happened to me was wrong, and I'm going to make the world pay for it? It's kind of, difficult for me to look back on too, because, when I first read Dr. van der Kolk's book, it was like the very first time I sort of understood the mechanics of why I felt and reacted and saw the world like the way that I did. And, how much could I have benefited if I had somebody working with me, in my teens or in my 20s even? How much could I have kind of regained of my, productivity and sanity if I had had a little bit earlier of an intervention? It wasn't really until my early 40s that I discovered the book and had counselors that helped me, through talk therapy, kind of unwind these things. But if my family had money and influence and political power, and they could isolate me in a bubble and sort of pump these family values of domination at all costs into me, would my life have gone a lot differently? So I just think it's so important that as a society we start building these kind of safety nets to help people that might have been oblivious to it until an older age, an enlightenment when they kind of stumble on, like I did, what's happening inside. If we can help that knowledge continue to go, down to younger age groups, and also, psychologists and school counselors and doctors, if we could catch these things earlier, even if the world was 1% kinder, do you know how much of an impact that could possibly make? Maybe it's one less, world dictator that, is coping with their childhood generational trauma by just consuming everything around them to try to fill this hole that they can never fill, because they never reflect or have a mentor or somebody they eventually feel safe with. They just use their power to sort of live their idealist coping fantasies, and everyone around them suffers for it. So can this DTD diagnosis literally change the world? I know it's an idealist thought, but I feel it's incredibly powerful self-understanding that is important for anybody who's feeling a little off to consider. So the big question is, can a person with developmental trauma heal to the point where they do not pass cellular methylation down to their offspring? And I'm really hopeful that answer is a yes. And I think we see anecdotes in this book where people with horrendous childhood experience, can ultimately gain an understanding and heal and have the empowerment to really change the whole direction. So the inspiration for the day is it ends with me. And with that, let's go ahead and throw out the microphone there for some open discussion. And I see we got Haya up on the board first. If it's all right, I'll get you the camera.
Yeah. Thank you for this. It's a really good way to pause our series because I think it reaches at a broader level to how we're all participating in traumatic childhood experiences and looking away and not prioritizing it and how much that cascades long term. When I was in college, one of the more pivotal moments of that learning was a trauma psychology course where the professor, who was from Israel, and this feels important because the whole context of what he was, or as context to what he was teaching, was very alternative in his frames of what trauma is, and just was bringing theories that I had never seen before and healing methodologies. And so really interesting kind of, sample course of many different directions. But one of the things he taught us was about the generation that created Nazi Germany and Hitler. And your poster a few back reminds me of this, is that there was a psychiatrist that wrote a series of books on parenting right before the generation that became the Nazis was born. And within just a few years, the overall zeitgeist of parents being gentle and touching and affectionate and relational with their children turned inside out on its head. And parents in these books were encouraged to use corporal punishment publicly on their children as a way to create national solidarity and loyalty. And his whole hypothesis was, and there are others who have actually written articles and he was showing, is basically saying this is potentially a very big cause of what happened later on. That the generation that became Nazis were very ripe for an extremist influence because of this childhood trauma that was not just a individual shock and harm to their systems, but it was a collective trauma of a disorientation of identity and duty. And that, so what I've been thinking about lately is how does that explain the resurgence of white supremacy that is happening right now, and what is mirroring that harm that was happening to children that made them incredibly vulnerable as young adults and adults to this powerful influence of prejudice and hate. And I wonder how much it is a combination of systems that say it's not important to classify and acknowledge, which is kind of the other direction. It's like, let's erase this, let's not take the proof we have that this is a problem. But then also how social media and algorithms that are motivated to keep our attention and utilize our attention, and the effect that that's happening on children and youth, to where that sense of certainty to pick a binary of I like it or I don't like it. I'm going to block you or I'm going to be your friend. Those are my two options, kind of thing. That addiction to that certainty, that confidence, can create this need to feel part of something that has a bigger strategy and plan and has a almost an adrenaline rush to it, I guess, that our current political system in the United States really fulfills. So it's a bit out there, but it does have parallels, and it does at least hopefully validate a little bit or use some agreement to say, yeah, we're not looking at instead of reinforcing a belief of evil in the world, what if we just looked at this as like fragmented systems of child rearing that create toxic and traumatic relationships between caregivers and children that lead to a nervous system overload and an addiction to certainty that creates mob mentality and movements that cause incredible destruction and harm.
Well, yeah, you said it there. I think that's a really very kind of detailed and you added quite a lot of the complexity and very eloquently in like how that like manifests. And my personal belief is that I think a similar thing happened through economics, particularly in the U.S. because when I was growing up as a Gen Xer, we were kind of taught like you go to college and you buy your house and you get married and that's like the American dream. Well, I graduated into a recession. By the time I could afford a house, they had quadrupled in price. And this all probably sounds familiar to Gen Z and Gen Alpha and the millennials, but it happened to them like 1,000 times % worse. And what I noticed is like, I think as a Gen Xer, it's like the rug was kind of like pulled underneath us, like on the fly. But the millennials sort of recognized that the system was broken like very early. And I noticed a real empathetic shift, like between Gen Xers and millennials and Zoomers, because I would go back to like school reunions and stuff, and their conversations were always so like, not like hating the system, but like, why is the system the way it is? Like, why couldn't it just be, make more sense? And like that attitude really surprised me, and it actually like ignited my hope for the future too, because I was like, once the numbers of Zoomers and Gen Alphas become like politically relevant, are we going to start seeing politicians like prioritize kindness and having a society as legislation? And my fear is like I almost feel like there's an exploitative like boogeyman that's sort of entering the picture, and it's like the narrative is now changing to like these marginalized demographics are like the reason like you don't have the things, like not the systems that completely broke down around everybody because they had gates and fences built around them, but these your neighbors and your friends are the reason now that and I hope we don't fall for it. I hope we're just in the beginning where everyone has to wake up and be like, okay, yeah, not gonna happen, but we'll see. We're at an inflection point. I think, but what I was kind of responding to your point is I think that physical, beating of a child for nationalistic reasons, like sort of morphed into economics. In the U.S., where it's like we're going to withhold prosperity from you, but we're going to shower you with propaganda that the American dream exists, when it crumbled, in my lifetime.
Yeah. Well, and I want to just also acknowledge, without preference either way. The two images you've had in the last two slides, the one with the wheel and I'm going to break the wheel, I'm not going to pause it. So I think it's a really interesting acknowledgement of what happens with trauma, where we're in this frozen place and we feel powerless. And finally, when we get to that place of agency and change, there's a over reaction because it's a delayed reaction. And so instead of I'm going to refine the wheel, I'm going to change the wheel, I'm going to tweak the wheel, I'm going to transform the wheel, it's I'm going to break it. And how much, that word break doesn't just mean to destroy, it also means to pause. But in this case, the pausing is being eliminated. And how much of what is trauma, literally, I can reach my hand out to you and touch you, or I can reach my hand out to you and slap you. And the difference there is speed. And so how much of this is that we don't know how to pause, and we don't know how to take breaks and slow down and make space and let it be messy and ask for support, and all of those pieces that on the ground just seem like not the right answer when the world has so many bigger problems to it. It feels like just, I don't know, such a massive misunderstanding grew in that psychiatrist wrote those books. And I guess the last piece I'll say about that is that a parallel kind of piece of information that this professor presented was that infanticide in Germany went up like astronomically the year after that those books were released. And so this was, it gave such a visceral data point to realizing what corporal punishment looked like from one generation to the next. And that when a greater system promotes and encourages violence as a means of control and discipline, what is left except just breaking the wheel from the inside out? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a real inflection point, because it's like, I get myself worked up about it, and if I kind of just bring a can of gasoline to a bonfire, all I do is make the fire bigger, but at the same time, I think there's momentums of things that kind of need to stop. So it's like this dichotomy of like, what do? Do you just be the kind person that, is the one person that's calm in the room to help settle things, or do you rise to the challenge? These are not boring times. If you wanted to live in exciting times, here they are. But yeah, thanks for that commentary. And yeah, I'll be thinking about that. The corporal punishment several years before Nazi Germany. Wow. And I think we got Tom up on the board next. Let me throw the camera over to you there.
Well,
oh, great. We see you up there.
Yeah. Such weighty topics, and we've invoked, our times. And what I was thinking, my comment was going to come from you putting up the pictures of Stalin and those dudes, and it just is very moving to just, think of what could have happened. History could have been different if these people's lives had been different. And your idea that we could catch them all is where I think we can't do it. And I've done a lot of reading on violence and human nature, and we're hunter-gatherers more violent than the early agriculturists, and people look at it, they interpret data. Pinkerton says we're getting less. Steven Pinker says we're getting less violent. Yeah. One thing that everybody says is there has been this psychotic personality type. Psychotic's just a big word, but this personality type that somehow is able to just command others by their by this abusive authoritarian behavior, and what you get in return, what Haya just said, is what you get in return is this certainty, this little endorphin hit because Stalin was beloved. That's the thing you always have to remember. We see him as this boogeyman. Mm-hmm. People cried in long ending lines for days and days and days when he died. He was Papa Stalin, because people got a little good rush thing of somehow feeling they were part of something bigger under that harsh father. But to me, needing to get your kicks that way, sorry for being so colloquial, you get a short-term little hit, but there's a homeostatic process, I think, in human society that balances that. Stalin doesn't happen forever. As you some know, I've come today from the 50th anniversary of the fall of Phnom Penh to the Khmer Rouge, which is as dark a national trauma as you can get, all in one day, an entire city of 4 people wiped out. But in 50 years, I've seen what the resilience of the human spirit can be. So there is a homeostasis here. And what it is, I think, is this mutual aid versus competition. That's what we go back and, do we all fundamentally just want to kill each other so we can get it all for ourselves? Or do we understand that the higher forces are desire to help each other so that together we can get through this? And as you said, Scott, once you start helping other people, you learn more about helping yourself. It's this beautiful thing. Once mutual aid grows on itself, mutual aid seems to come to the fore when time is toughest. All I'm saying is somehow maybe we have to go through the deepest shit to bring out the best sides of us, the sides of us that do the things that get the endorphins working so that we actually start, helping each other. But somehow, I know vaccination is a loaded word now, but we need to be vaccinated against the kind of short-term fix you get from Papa Stalin, so that instead we, opt for that incredible, more durable joy that you get from being part of a community where people are helping each other. They're like a great basketball team. You get to win by playing your role and helping all that stuff. And I think as hard as things are now, it just might be an inevitable dynamic of history that we have to feel things to be as threatening as we do right now, maybe to bring out the mutual aid side of us and start to turn it a little bit. I know it doesn't answer all the questions, but it's what comes to mind too when you raise these thoughts, and I listen to Ruthu. So thanks, Scott, for bringing it up.
Yeah, sure. I loved your basketball analogy. I'm trying to think of the Celtics player that won the 8 championships, because he won by making everyone around him better, not as just an individual talent, but he rose like anyone that played with him to that championship caliber.
And I don't want to get off on sports, but it is Larry Bird who was famous for going to the guy who was the 11th guy on the team and saying, "You're going to be in on this big play. They're all going to be looking for this other guy, so get ready. I'm probably going to pass it to you." That is true. But the real point of what I'm saying is these psychotic types that I think are responsible for most violence and most feeling part of something bigger, so we engage in violent behavior, whatever. I think that we're coming to a time when the attraction of that will start to turn in the other direction.
Yeah, it's very cyclical, right? Yeah, we go through kind of waves.
It's like a thermostat, there's a set point, and then it overcompensates, and then it has to go back again. But there is a human set point, I think. It's the only way I can look at it. It's the only way I can look at it. So anyway, thanks for making it.
No, my biggest fear, and it's like it gives me a lot of existential dread, that I sort of struggle with on a daily basis, is that as humanity, as a species, we're gonna face some real external or existential threat, at the downturn of one of these phases where we're least cooperative with each other. And there's kind of a movie about it, Don't Look Up, which I think is our modern sort of Dr. Strangelove. And it's a play-by-play of what our society would do if an asteroid was literally going to hit in 6 months, and it's not a pretty picture, but it's scary, Scott, true.
We could solve all these things. That's what you said very clearly at the beginning of this. If we could just understand that we're all on the same team, we could solve all these things. And maybe it takes this. I don't mean like Mars bringing us together. I mean the real existential threat is ourselves. That side of ourselves that thinks that I got to take care of myself because there's not enough to go around. Not the side of ourselves that realizes that we're all in it together. That's the existential threat, ourselves. The end.
Yeah. Yeah, and also I know you have an event with a dear friend coming up this weekend. I think right on the Khmer Rouge topic that you mentioned. When is that happening?
That was actually today, but that's okay. I'm not here to promote any events. I'm just trying to actually make an upbeat story following what Ruth said. Another thing about what Haya said is that another upbeat way to look at this is there are times when you can influence people. One of those times is when they become parents, because no one who becomes a parent, speaking as someone who did it, knows what the heck to do. And anyone that comes around that sounds halfway decent, you're probably going to try it. Well, that can be pretty awful, as the story shows, but it can also be an opportunity time. And there's other times when people are influenceable too, not just when they become parents. Another one is when they realize they're going to die, but I won't go off on that one now.
Mm-hmm.
Very well put. Yeah, thanks for adding all that additional color to the topic too. And yeah, we got KT up on the board next. Let me put the camera over for you. Hello there.
I wanted to play off what Haya was saying. She was talking about a generation that was had a lot of aggression poured out on it. But what I started observing, and maybe because I didn't have kids, I'm a little more objective on this, I don't know. But what I started seeing is that parents started using technology as babysitters.
Mm-hmm.
So put their kids down first in front of the television instead of going out and playing games, Sandlot baseball and all that kind of stuff. They set them down and they got whatever programming was coming in from TV. And then it was little handheld game devices. And then it was iPads. And it just broke my heart when I had a friend who got iPads for each of their children, and their children were, at least two of them were on the spectrum. And this person was very much an advocate for parents with children who had autism, and would charge around the state and talk to the legislature and all this kind of stuff. But her own kids couldn't get her attention. When they asked for attention, she shoved an iPad in front of them. And another parent whose children were friends with her children reported to me that she always read to her children. And the daughter of the person I was talking about told her, she said, "I wish somebody would read to me." And that just broke my heart. And I can tell that the mother had trauma in her childhood. And I know some of the things that went on when she was young. And so I can see that the trauma was just being passed down. But the bigger point I wanted to make is that so many parents were so busy scrolling on social media and letting their children be in headsets or, at 8 or 5. And in other words, just using technology and just shoving their children away, and not engaging with them and not giving them the love and the touch. And some of this has to do with both parents working in the U.S. system. But when I look at Europe, they have more time off, per week, a whole month vacation off in the whole year, and health care and college or trade school paid through taxes, where it evens out the payments for everybody. And I just see a very different cultural style in terms of dealing with families. You look at Scandinavia, where you can have up to 2 or 3 years off. One parent can take a year and a half, and the other parent can take a year and a half, and the child is cared for by the parents, subsidized by the companies and the taxes and whatnot. And it's just such a different approach that it still allows both parents to work. I'm definitely not into telling women they should stay home with the kids. I would never say that. But I think Europe has come up with a much better solution, maybe because of what happened in Nazi Germany. Maybe that influenced how they took a different path than we did. So I see on the one hand the example she was showing of aggressing on children, and the other of just detaching from them and throwing them off on their own. And I think both are kinds of trauma that are then showing up in what we see in culture today. But I really like the idea of the younger generations turning to each other for support to understand the system. I'm watching the show Sort of, that we were watching before. I'm starting at the beginning on it. And I can see how individuals who've been traumatized and were having a tough time were supporting each other. And I'm wondering if maybe that's not where our homeostasis is going to come from, to bring our society back around to a little more healthier approach. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, that's one of my real hopes, and that's not to put some kind of like hero moniker on the poor younger generations that are dealing with the same age-old problems, but to come together like that and ultimately have the realization one day that like, oh, nothing is standing in our way anymore of like putting these major reforms in, because as a society, you brought up two really big ones. One is, the economics of now, like the mother and the father, or, alternatively father and father, like both have to work to make ends meet, not because they want to get ahead of the Joneses, like just to afford life. And that changed, that came about, through our current generations, is like the necessity of both parents working instead of choosing to. And the other is the time, right? Like, so if one parent gets 1.5 years of maternity leave and then the next can take theirs, that's 3 solid years of attention that child has access to. And how much does that raise the probability of somebody growing up like without a dysregulated nervous system and going out into society carrying these coping mechanisms of a dysregulated system and having to do all the self-work to change that trajectory. So like, these are the kinds of differences I think that generations could unite to actually create, is this interdependence of like just being crushed by the economics of our current policies, and also time away from work. Like, why do we have to work our lives away for GDP? Like, I mean, we're crashing our GDP anyways. So what's the point? Yeah, lower it down. I think these would be incredible impacts to just the gross numbers of trauma that occurs like in the world. These are really low hanging fruits of what could be done to sort of make a huge difference. In the other direction, we saw an example of a national policy that could take it in the opposite direction, like freedom of economics and free time to self-actualize goes completely the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really, really great observations and commentary there. And oh, great! I'm glad you raised your hand, Carl. I see you up there. Let me throw the camera your way.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of in a little more of a pensive mood today. I was planning on just kind of giving a generic. I mean, I'm still going to do that, so I'll just go ahead and say, thank you very much for hosting this event. This section of it, I've really enjoyed the ones I've been able to. A little more than I was initially thinking, just because my schedule and some days I ended up being off work. But I'm consistently impressed with the stuff you put together and the presentation. So I love that, and thank you for doing it. I'm definitely a yapper, and I was more just kind of appreciating everyone's shares there, and Katie kind of really you got the wheels wheels turning a lot for me there on, you know, a lot of how this is all like, you know, related in ways. So I'm trying to kind of crystallize some of those thoughts like as I speak here. So I haven't really planned out what I want to say beyond, so I did kind of initially bristle at the comparison to, like the, you know, the observation from the chapter about, like kind of the lead up to the nationalism of Nazi Germany, and then, you know, trying us kind of comparing that to today, where I'm sure there are plenty of similarities, and there's definitely many similarities. But as far as the kind of societal zeitgeist at the time, like it almost feels like a polar opposite, or rather that polar opposite exists, you know, the very like progressive, you know, any physical correction of a child is abuse, and, you know, the kind of more progressive kind of ideals of today compared to, you know, comparing that to, you know, encouraging people to do the opposite, basically, like beat your kids in the street. It shows we're all working together here. So, but what I do see that in that comparison though is like the disparity we have today, and that's where like I'm like really aligns with what Katie was saying. I think this like if you just compare like the lives of, you know, somebody that lives in rural areas versus people that live in inner cities, like they're basically different countries, you know, like we don't really, you know, have that same framework, that same upbringing and perspective. So when, you know, we came up, myself, I should say, you know, came up in like the inner city and like public schools, and I've always been surrounded by very progressive people. But there is like this, even, you know, in my circle, this like on the outskirts, like family that lives in the country. And, you know, there's this view, I think, of like softness, of privilege, of like getting everything handed to you. And then, so it's like the pushback against that is where I see, and that again is where I see it like tying it again to the chapter, this idea of, I kind of lost the train there. So it's like a pendulum swing, you know, and we're as we swing more towards the progressive side, the folks that see that, and even if it isn't like a, you know, known named thing, like I see it as like an envy, you know, like that, like with the college student loans and everything, that whole, I had to pay back my loan, so they should too. This like, the sense of like, I had it rough, so they shouldn't have it easy, you know? And, like that to me has always been a very, like an idea I just can't wrap my head around, because if I went through something rough, I don't want anyone to have to deal with that. I would rather them not. And then, you know, it goes back into what Tom was saying about, there is though the whole, you know, growth through adversity, and without hardship, it is harder to become a better person. Like that kind of is the cheat code to, you know, getting through things is, or rather improving as a person is like having to get through something, having to deal with some sort of potentially traumatic event. So I think that kind of the core question there of like, you know, will that be adopted into the DSM? Would that be, you know, the cure to what ails us in some ways? I don't know. That I think it would be, because I think kind of like with a lot of things where we're putting them on a spectrum these days, you know, I think to a certain degree, like people need to deal with some hardship. They need to, you know, kind of grow through conflict, but at the same time, it's as with everything, it's always a matter of degrees. You know, you can't you can't somehow make that institutionalized. You can't I guess we could send people out into the desert. You know what I mean? Like, here, it's your time for your coming of age hardship. And actually, maybe as a thought to kind of start wrapping this up, is just a funny thing that I have heard that I like. Some countries have their like required military service. Definitely not a fan of that, but I've seen joking posts that float like, oh, there should be a required period of like working in the service industry. Like you should have to work at Walmart for, or some equivalent for like at least a year just to humanize you a bit. Like, and, that's not easy, but probably good for some folks. So I don't know. I feel like I said a lot of things, and I'll stop now.
Yeah, I really like that idea of like some type of year of universal income, and you work at like the corner diner or something. That's like as a server. That would be a very eye-opening experience for I believe for some people, and a growth experience too. Yeah, and I think the key to that too is like the socialization that we might have. Not eliminated from life, but gravitated towards, like the example of, our kids kind of now being handed an iPad instead of, reading. Because I have an interesting...
The parenting part of it.
Yeah, I know you have lots of examples. When I hear the iPad story, it's funny because I have a mixed relationship with it, because I discovered video games like probably around the age of like 6 or 8, and it was like I found my place, to turn on my video game and sort of immerse myself into it was like the best feeling in the world. Like that was my primary caregiver in some respects, was my Magnavox Odyssey 2, and then ultimately my Nintendo and my PlayStation. I found my sense of self, like in that experience. So like when I hear the stories about the kids getting like their iPads and their phones, like I sort of wonder to myself, like, even though they're missing that parental component, like, are they sort of finding their freedom in their feet, through the experience? So is there some potential, benefits there? But if it's ultimately dividing us, and isolating us from one another, we do need some type of solution for that, because I do think that there has been a failing, like our rural neighbors and brothers and sisters, I think have had not the type of focus that's really needed for like their challenges and priorities, and that level of resentment is the slap on the cheek, that we're getting for having these dense populations in cities that tend to vote progressive. And we do need some sort of reconciliation for that. I hope it can be a coming together, just like you described, as maybe we turn the other cheek and figure it out.
I think the hard part is, like I was always saying, everything's on a spectrum. So like I've always been really fond of the phrase, all generalizations are wrong. Like, kind of by its nature, like, the more something is generalizing, the more wrong it is, including that statement. But so to look at these issues and kind of say, oh, well, we need to do X, is like, it's minimalizing to a degree, it feels like. And it's like, there's always going to be, people who fall through the cracks, or kind of like I just always kind of push back a little bit when I start to hear, like, if we refer to like, oh, the people who are rural. I mean, as much as we may have seen that, kind of point of view can be monolithic in some ways, and we were all kind of surprised by the numbers on this previous election, I think. But the idea that like there's one solution for everyone, or that like, this happened because of X, and it's something that 300 million people did, or you know what I mean. It to me, I'm always always looking for the kind of ways where, like, the obvious kind of, not necessarily, incorrect for most people or situations answer is, gonna fail, gonna not cover all the bases,
Yeah, absolutely. The falling through the cracks part, like you said, you put it right out there for everyone to see, because these kind of sweeping generalized policies towards some particular goal, it always has exclusionary components to it, and I think that's what's put us on the path that we're on currently. So always open to solutions for that.
Yeah, I think, I don't know that I'd call it a solution, but I always try to pretty much anytime, and I know Haya has some language things that she's shared with us, like the I statements and those sort of things, which I'm pretty guilty of myself constantly. But in that way, when I hear statements that are very broad, just like women are X, I'm just like, and like it immediately kind of sets off that alarm in me where I kind of am a little more critical.
Yeah, very subtle, these kind of qualifying statements, like, I am an IT support person, like, we sort of lose the context of how powerful it is to say I am or you are something. That's a really big statement.
Yeah, I share in that. Definitely, I think of language as more like clinical and precise than kind of emotional. So I'm always like, that's the thing I think I'm most critical of when I finish talking at any point is like, was I a jerk? Did I come across with that? Did I push somebody away with that rather than connect? Because I think that's kind of the core of it. I'm generally in speaking and kind of to tie it back to this stuff, like I'm trying to always kind of, like in my broad example there, if somebody's just like, oh, women are X, I'm like, some women are X, and like that'll just be my input there at the beginning, and I'm like, oh, okay,
True that.
just to kinda,
thanks
the
for
women you've
doing
met are X, and it could be anything, whether they're talking about something technical or a certain type of video game or whatever the case may be. It doesn't have to be something so kind of social justice-y, but just in that way that as a technical person, like I was actually explaining this to my kid earlier, the idea of like, there's a lot of stuff scientifically speaking that is possible, but highly, highly, highly unlikely. So rarely do you hear scientists say like, this is not true or this is impossible. They'll just say, highly unlikely, or there's always that qualifier and trying to like kind of cover your ass, make sure you're not going to be proven wrong in the future by using those little weasel words. Sometimes I think of them where it's, like, yeah, I'm saying this, but just in case I'm wrong, I did say might in that sentence somewhere.
Yeah, a perfect example is the James Webb detecting what was it, the methyl dioxide, or there's a molecule in a planet that is about 1 trillion light years away that we only know that this molecule can be produced by biological life. Like, we don't know of any natural process that could produce it in that quantity, and the information is at like a 97% like confidence level. And the scientists still say we might have found life. We believe that this is the strongest evidence we found, but they won't say found life, right? Like these kind of sweeping generalizations can be harmful. So, thanks for being the person that slows it down when it comes up.
And I do remember kind of where that thought came from, that I can tie it back actually to Katie's comments, like with the parenting stuff. And that is kind of where I try to, like, I think maybe it was this event or a different one, but, had the quote, trying to remember the quote of like all things in their measure, that kind of thing, where like my kids do have pretty unfettered access to technology, but there was also like a real early conversation with mom and me and them about like, yeah, you've got access to everything on there. So, first off, be careful. You see something weird, feel free to come ask me about it. But also, be responsible. And I may come check at any time, and they are also expected to, do any sort of sports and school activities and that sort of stuff. If not, of course, not forced, but just in general, that idea of, I give my kids the technology, but I try to be responsible about it. I, even some things that, other parents are pretty careful about what sort of like age rating content they get access to. And it's like, we're showing here, you're a product of your parents. My parents didn't really care what I watched, so I don't care what they watch for the most part. There's a, understanding that if they, need to talk about it, we will. And in many other ways, I kind of, when it comes to like recreational stuff, when it comes to, probably my biggest failing in that is not doing enough physical activity myself, but just being aware of those facts and kind of recognizing that there's not much in the world that is outright bad, and there's not really many bad guys. Most people think they're doing right by them and theirs. So trying to understand people's perspectives and that's what I try to impart in my kids when it comes to like their access to things and trying to encourage their relationship. So I see the solution not so much as saying like, this is the way to do it. This is what worked for me, so other people should do it, but more in that communicating, connecting, modeling those kind of behaviors for other people. Somebody's like, oh, you let your kids have their own iPad? Like, yeah, but I've got this to monitor it, and they come and tell me about something cool they saw every few days or something. So there's I don't leave them, but more so in that I'm like showing to that person who is critical that I am mindful, not so much in arguing like, no, it's fine, you're wrong because of X. Just like, oh, this is what worked for me. And kind of I see that as the kind of the best way forward with all of this, is like just the modeling, the communicating and connecting. So, and that's very hard to like make a policy or like have a big symposium that's going to get everybody on board. It's more of a grassroots individual kind of thing that can only spread like organically, I guess.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thought because it's you turn the non-community argument like on its ear, right? And you're like, no, like we did take this kind of antisocial, kind of aspect that people think of when they think of a phone or a tablet, and we turned it social, right? Like now it's the the groundwork for more conversation and more knowledge, because that's another thing that just about our current times that still blows my mind is if you have a cell phone and you have an internet that's not restricted, like in some countries, you pretty much have the whole of human knowledge like at your fingertips. Like, how incredible is that?
Even that framing is big. I think just real quick, I wanted to say, I will often say to people just as like an introduction of like what I do for fun, if I start talking to somebody, I say my entire social life is on the internet. And like, I think if that was phrased as something like, oh, I'm chronically online or I'm addicted to social media, like those have very kind of negative connotations, but they're kind of all the same statement, but kind of phrasing it in a way of like, yes, I have a life, I have a social life, it happens to be on the internet. Like 90% 85% of it, but kind of is that like the phrasing, the framing of things can very much impact how people look at things. We've definitely seen, but it's a very delicate thing, and how to, like, you get into that whole policing language thing, and then people push back on that. So I just try to be not necessarily careful, but I'm pretty mindful, I think, of like certain phrases that I think are not necessarily phrases, but just wording, that is negative. I don't know. I didn't mean to ramble this much.
No, that's all right. That's a wonderful reflection, and also, the share and the contribution to the discussion. And I see a hand from Hayes coming around. I'm wondering if you might have a hard stop. I was going to mention, do you think we should take a photo while we're together and we haven't all dialed out yet? Or I could use some help.
Way to close here, because that was what my hand was seeing. I think we've lost people, but to try to grab whoever is still here to finish with a photo, because I got to go. So cool,
yeah, for sure.
Cool transition.
You want to take a picture with Hitler and Stalin?
Yeah.
And...
This is The Body Keeps the Score of Dictators edition. What did their bodies keep as a score for them? Is the question. Technically, the culture in VR Tat might really embrace.
Are we close enough?
Yeah, let's go with it.
The anime girl reenactors.
Right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks for the photo. We hadn't taken one yet, so I'm excited to have one.
Happy Body Keeps the Score.
What's our
Chapter
buzzword?
910.
Yeah, chapter 910.
Chapter 910.
Chapter 910. Aw. Yay. Okay, I got a good one. I will post that. Oh, nice dancing. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you so much to Scott for hosting this series. It's been really wonderful, and grateful to your willingness to take a pause. I mean, this is actually the perfect one to end on, because we had a real heart to heart, around this, and this idea of here we're on a roll, and we all have built this habit of looking at this every week, and we're pausing in the middle of it, and it feels kind of cringe to me too, the one who set the structure up in the first place. But also, there's grace that we're building as a bridge together in respecting the cycles as they've been built, and letting ourselves just rest, in between as much as possible, and get some reflection and see how we want to build this differently going forward. And so any feedback that any of you have, those watching the stream and also in person, we're going to be doing a debrief together sometime next week, Scott and I, on kind of what worked about this, what do we want to change going forward, and welcome any of those feedback pieces, especially if you want to. You can either direct message Scott or I, or you can also put it just in the event Discord, where we share little articles and whatever else. And that way we can have some of your feedback. And if you're interested in coming to that debrief, you can also let us know on that. So, yay.
Yeah, thanks in return. And looking forward to any feedback while we pause too, and open to, very, pragmatic type of feedback too. If you feel like we're going long, or if you feel, we should put something in the world, like a color change, like that kind of stuff. I promise I'll do what I can, for anything that comes up, within the constraints of our abilities.
Lovely. Okay. Be well, everyone. And go do body breaks.
Bye.
Good night.
Yep, let's do it. Good night. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night, KT.